today, what are you doing? That's the most interesting question. As the world is being murdered, what are you doing to defend the earth? And what are you doing to undercut many of the assumptions, such as the idea that you can own land? What are you doing to undercut and destroy those? The other day, somebody posted a meme on Facebook asking the question, if slavery were still legal, would you date someone who owned slaves? And I thought in some ways the question was a little bit absurd and a little bit crazy, because if we were living in the South 180 years ago, it's easy at this remove to go, oh my God, that is so terrible. Of course, I would never do that. And I would virtue signal my way through life and be able to stand up for this atrocity that we all perceive as being well in the past. But the truth is that if you were born in the American South and raised in the American South in 1820, the chances are pretty good you would have simply accepted this as a fact of life. And the way to think about this is, today, would you date someone who believes you can own land? What a crazy question. Of course I would date somebody who owns their own land. But that's the thing, is you can't own land any more than you can own other people, because the land is a living being as well. But that is an atrocity that still falls under the rubric of unquestioned assumptions that guide our culture. And so there are the atrocities that have become completely normalized are normal, and you don't think they're atrocities. I think one of my favorite lines in the culture make-believe is that any hatred felt long enough no longer feels like hatred. It feels like economics or religion or just the way things are. And so there's sort of part one of this discussion. And part two of this discussion is addressing the idea of ownership, that there's a sense in which, we are all just this process of living and going through life, and there is no, and ownership is purely a convention. But there's another sense in which it's not merely a convention, or if it is a cross-species convention, because certainly songbirds will have territory and spiders will have territory, and we all have, I've seen often bears chase other bears out of territory. And this is one reason, by the way, that when people think they are doing a good thing by trapping a bear or trapping a creature of any sort and relocating it, they're most often not doing a good thing. And I'm not talking about intentional attempts to reintroduce, for example, giant anteaters to habitat where they were and they aren't now, because that is empty habitat. But if Fish and Game traps a quote problem bear, end quote, and moves it somewhere else, it's moving into the territory that belongs to somebody else, and most of them end up dying anyway. But the point is that this culture has taken a natural necessity for maintaining a certain habitat and turn that into a tool for increasing power to the already powerful. It has turned it into, I'm just reading a biography of Genghis Khan, and it's very interesting that basically the Mongols wanted to capture everywhere in the world, and they wanted to take over all territory. And so we end up with, we go from, somehow in this culture, go from, you know, that tree needing a certain amount of space around it in order to collect the energy from the sun, and that spider needing a certain amount of space in order to collect flies, to the concrete of the planet, through forgetting that territory is supposed to be about maintaining bodily integrity and about maintaining habitat integrity, and turning it into, you know, I think that I don't think that the birds and the bears own the land. I think when they have the territory, what they're doing is entering into a relationship with that land such that at a certain population density, they are in fact improving the land, and the land is improving them. And this leads to a whole nother discussion too, that I was having a discussion with a couple of sort of Dawkinsian mechanistic scientists who are saying that all creatures at all times are on the verge of starvation, because because creatures will expand their population until the place can't support any more of them, in which case all of them are on the edge of starvation at all times, and they're all then competing for that last scrap of food or the last place to sleep. And when I had that discussion with them, I was not able to respond to that statement. Basically, the statement came up because people act differently, including non-human people act differently when they're in a world with a fair amount of abundance than when there is a world of complete scarcity. And think about going to the bank, and you go to the bank and you stand in line, and then you withdraw however much money you're going to need. But if there's a run on the bank, then everybody's going to be pushing and shoving to get to the front of the line to get their money out before anybody else. Or you can go to the grocery store and you stand in line nicely, but if there is an emergency, then people will react differently, and they will be fighting over that last loaf of bread. And the people I was talking to were talking about how they thought that's how the world actually is, so that you will have bears expand their population until they're all fighting over the last scrap of food or over the last den. You'll have salmon will expand until they're all slightly hungry all the time, and they're all fighting over the last bit of food. At the time, I didn't have a response to this, but I realized later that I think they are incorrect, and I think that it is not evolutionarily in your best interest to have everybody on the verge of starvation at all times. Instead, if the carrying capacity of a place is 1,000 buffalo, you're not going to have generally 1,000 buffalo. You will have 600, because it is in your survival best interest to have the females be fat and healthy to better raise children. And so the optimal place will be that you are doing fairly well, and you have 600 bears or buffalo or frogs or whatever in a space that can hold 1,000. And that's when you end up in the conflicts over the resources, is when some other group comes in that tries to push it up to 1,000. You will fight over that territory at that point, because you want to be at the level which is optimum both for your survival and for the survival of the land. And I realize we've come quite a ways afield from this, but to sort of sum up, it is very difficult for us, as always, to deconstruct what we have been taught for generations. And so, to go back to the beginning, people can say gleefully that, gosh, if I were living in the Middle Ages, I would never have dated someone who burned witches. But I love this line about how, if you want to know how you would have acted then, it's how you're acting now. And that back to the Genghis Khan thing, that it was extraordinary and sad that when the Mongols started to invade Europe, what happened, one of the things that happened was the Christians started burning Jews. And they blamed the Jews for this for some ridiculous reason. And then they, even as far away as Great Britain, where the Mongols had no chance of ever getting, they were, some communities wiped out all the Jews there. And then later, 100 years later, however long, when the Black Death came, what do you know, they decided to burn Jews again. And whenever there was any crisis. And so the reason I'm bringing all this up is that that was normalized. This hatred of the Jews was normalized among the Christians of Europe. And it would take an extraordinary person to be able to untangle that and to act like a decent human being and to go against the flow of that. I think it's interesting and, sort of a fun party game to ask, what would I have done in Nazi Germany? Would I have dated somebody who was not protecting Jews and communists? And would I have dated somebody who wasn't resisting the Nazis? And we can go back to, would I have dated somebody who was not opposing the Roman Empire? And those are all interesting and fun questions. But the question that really interests me is not even who you would date, actually, but would you yourself have been one of the abolitionists? Who cares if you date an abolitionist? You should be an abolitionist. And then today, what are you doing? That's the most interesting question. As the world is being murdered, what are you doing to defend the earth? And what are you doing to undercut many of the assumptions, such as the idea that you can own land? What are you doing to undercut and destroy those? The problem with ownership is that we have it completely backwards, that instead of possessing land, we should be possessed by it. And we believe that when we own land, in this culture, that gives you the right to do whatever you want to do with it. You can destroy it. Basically, in this culture, ownership means I have the right to use and destroy. But what it should really mean is that if I quote own land, if I am possessed by land, then what that means is that I am responsible for it. And responsible comes from the root respondere, which means to give in return. And so the real question that needs to be asked about any land is, and any possessions, really, anything that possesses us, is what can I do to make this land better on its own terms? There's a line that I love that I came up with in Walking on Water, which is an editor's job is to help the writer say what the writer wants to say in the way the writer wants to say it, only better. An editor's job is not to have the writer say something different. And the editor's job is not to have the writer say something different in a different way. but it's to help them say, it's to help the writer say what the writer wants to say in the way the writer wants to say it, only better. And that is our relationship for friendship. This is why I love that line. My job as a friend is not to tell my friends that what they're doing is wrong. My job is to help them do what they want to do in the way they want to do it, only better. And my job as someone who is in relationship with any land is to help the land do what the land wants to do in the way the land wants to do it, only better.